Chapter 14. Cults, Conspiracy and Psychic Epidemics. "I want to touch you, move you and inspire you," said a friend to me during an out-of-the-blue phone call, over a decade ago. He told me about an incredible self-development course he was taking and asked me to come along and see what it was about for myself. Inquisitive, I asked questions about why he thought this course would be good for me. Was he telling everyone about it or just me? If just me, then why? How would it move and inspire me? Although he raved about it, he couldn't actually describe the course content clearly or explain why it would benefit me. It wasn't enough to convince me to part with a few £100 and risk falling into this brand of inarticulate euphoria. My then husband decided to sign up for it though. "I want to touch you, move you and inspire you," said my husband when he came home, late, the first evening of the course. Oh dear. Same words. Same euphoria. Same inability to describe why it was so good and why I should do it. Extremely unnerved, I was now absolutely certain I should not do the course, but research it instead. In the end, my husband and a few friends all took the landmark Forum, Human Potential, course. It's a large group awareness training program which has polarized people around the world. Some claim it has miraculously changed their lives. Some warn it is both a pyramid selling scheme and a dangerous cult. I learned that Landmark Forum used some very particular techniques. The training room had no natural daylight or clocks, so participants felt disorientated, and therefore more suggestible. Specific vocabulary that needs explaining to the outside world, such as racket, which is your state of being. Very specific and limited break times, so participants were hungry, thirsty, and needed the loo, making them feel physically uncomfortable but also infantilized and disempowered. Emotional manipulation. Hard selling to get new members. Long hours and homework, so the rest of life is just crowded out, making the experience more intense. I became interested in how cults work in general. When I told my husband I thought he had been brainwashed, he was shocked and deflated. There was a feeling I had ruined this for him. He completed the course but, to my relief, didn't take the next level. When we locked down in March 2020, I noticed that aspects of the situation, how we were managed by our leaders, and people's responses matched elements of cult programming. I wasn't alone. In July, Peter Hitchens wrote in his Mail on Sunday blog, "When this madness began, I behaved as if a new and fanatical religion was spreading among us. Be polite and tolerant, I thought. It may be crazy and damaging, but in time it will go away. Now it is clear that a new faith, based on fear of the invisible and quite immune to reason, has all but taken over the country. And it turns out to be one of those faiths that doesn't have much tolerance for those who don't share it. There are close parallels between cult induction, religious conversion and political propaganda. The similarity in techniques is the subject of Battle for the Mind, by William Sargant. As he said, religious conversion techniques often approximate so closely to modern political techniques of brainwashing and thought control that each throws light on the mechanics of the others. He noticed that Chinese Communist Party experiments on mass excitation and reconditioning of groups were comparable not just with religious conversion, but also group psychotherapeutic treatments. The politician, priest, police officer and psychologist all have much to learn from each other. As with the Landmark Forum, we all had to learn a new language at the outset of the COVID epidemic: social distancing, flatten the curve, self-isolate, build back better. We were captive indoors, and although our curtains could open, the days soon blended and we lost sense of time. Extreme emotional manipulation was standard fare from politicians and through the media. We were denied relationships, dating, to go out to work, to decide the minutiae of our lives. We were infantilized and disempowered. People gleamed with the heady fervor of cult novitiates. I am not suggesting that an overarching sinister cabal deliberately inducted us into a cult, or that Boris Johnson is a cult leader. But there are some parallels with cult leadership and induction. Perhaps it is simply the case that these techniques are naturally employed by particular types of leader who wish to command their subjects. Dr. Margaret Thaler Singer, author of Cults in Our Midst, The Continuing Fight Against Their Hidden Menace, was an expert in the steps required to brainwash people into joining cults. She described a thought reform program, whereby a person or an organization puts into place a coordinated program of coercive influence and behavior control. The novitiate puts their old value system aside and makes decisions based on what the cult leader wants and will reward, and stopping the behavior that will get them in trouble. Cults tend to be totalitarian. The leader has the power and decision-making. Our government ruled via ministerial diktat from March 2020. Questioning, doubt and dissent are discouraged in the cult, and cult leaders use feelings of shame and guilt in order to influence members. Often this is done through peer pressure and subtle forms of persuasion below the level of consciousness. This book has explored the tactics that were used on the British public. Contrary to popular opinion, you don't have to be a vulnerable or damaged person to be recruited to a cult. Anyone can join a cult. The recruiter will narrow your attention in a controlled situation and create an experience which leaves you panicky or disorientated. Remember Fright Night? That's when it began with a big bang, but it really began with little fizzles when you read doom-mongering headlines or watch China's stunt COVID videos. You are most susceptible to the cult when you are stressed and emotionally vulnerable. Next comes the love bombing. While you are emotionally vulnerable, you are flooded with affection and validation. A mere 4 days after Fright Night, most of the nation was clapping appreciatively in common purpose for the NHS. We flicked in a flash from fear to adulation. The media covered stories of death and the dangers of COVID, creating fear and vulnerability, as well as COVID heroes, love bombing, feel-good stories and aspirational behavior. Cults need to get hold of a good deal of a person's time, especially their thinking time, so they don't dwell on what's happening and don't think too critically about it, so they are split off from their friends and dependency is encouraged. The media and government press briefings took care of that. We have never been so socially atomized. Cults also use dependency and dread, creating a sense of powerlessness, anxiety and fear. Natural events are reframed to encourage obedience in members. Cult leaders almost always say that if you follow their rules it will help change the world and make it perfect. If followers leave the cult, they are told terrible disasters will befall them, they will die, or they won't have good karma, or some such flannel. The outside world, and the people in it, are presented as very dangerous. Does any of this sound familiar? In the case of the COVID cult, the ultimate consequence is death, because if you don't comply the virus will get you, or you'll be fined or shamed if you go out without a reasonable excuse. The novitiate's conscience is dimmed to accommodate new cult behavior and attitudes. Desensitization is important in cults, through seeing things done to other people. We became desensitized to things that would have been unacceptable to our conscience before. During the epidemic we were encouraged to snitch on neighbors, we grew nonchalant about the idea of life-destroying fines for breaches of rules. Remember that 2 students were fined £10,000 each for arranging a snowball fight, and we tolerated the transfer of infected elderly patients in hospital to care homes where they were like a spark to dry tinder, to give just a few examples of a relaxation of conscience. The leaders maintain a closed system of logic and restricting criticism. Management is always right, you are always wrong. Failed prophecies are reframed to maintain the authority of the cult leader, no matter what. If the prophecy did not come true, it's because the followers didn't follow the rules. Then the prophecy date gets moved forward. The UK's lockdowns couldn't offer a more apt example. We were told we must obey the rules for them to work. COVIDios were derided and blamed for failures in the media and social media. The finger was never pointed at hospital-acquired infections, for example, or the seasonality of the virus. It was our fault and we were easy scapegoats. Answer: the lockdowns were extended and repeated. The prophecy date for ending lockdown ever shifting. The book When Prophecy Fails, a social and psychological study of a modern group that predicted the destruction of the world, is the true story of a cult which believed in the coming apocalypse and that the cult followers would be rescued by aliens in a flying saucer. Several rescue dates were announced, but each passed without disaster or spacecraft. Through the medium of automatic writing, one of the members was told that Earth's apocalypse had been cancelled because the cult had waited patiently all night. The disappointments didn't shake their faith. Cult followers can double down on their beliefs to resolve the intense discomfort cognitive dissonance creates. Sometimes it just feels easier to stay wedded to false beliefs than to face the truth. The book's authors concluded that if someone was to remain a fervent believer in the face of such disappointment, then they must truly commit themselves firstly by taking difficult actions, and also by being part of a social group who are all committed. It is easy to draw a comparison with supporters of tough COVID restrictions, despite the lack of convincing evidence that they work. The commitment to the lockdown, our new normal, has been life-changing and immense for the country. People have held strong convictions during the epidemic. They have overestimated danger, placed enormous faith in unevidenced measures, and accepted vast social and personal changes. In a time of huge uncertainty, it has felt more comforting to cling to conviction. I expect I am guilty too. We will need more distance to understand the social experiment we have endured and where convictions were misplaced. How will people deprogram from cult thinking? This might be especially difficult for those who stand to lose professionally, such as scientists, journalists and politicians who expressed convictions and enacted policies publicly. By March 2021, Boris Johnson said, "Lockdown came too late," furthering the narrative that lockdown should have been earlier, harder, longer, sounding more like his opposition in the House of Commons, rather than acknowledging the empirical evidence against lockdowns. The confession served to endorse the role of lockdowns, therefore diverting attention from the collateral damage they caused and their ineffectiveness. I felt discombobulated by the early strong convictions held by others about COVID and lockdown. It was as though everyone had gone on a large group awareness training course for COVID and I'd missed the invite. I perceived a gap between rationality and reality. There were people who solely relied on the BBC and Number 10 press briefings, and then others who had ferreted around for alternative perspectives, such as the interview with Dr. Knut Witkowski, which was removed from YouTube, or read one of Dr. John Ioannidis's articles. A broad range of media offered balance, allowed room for doubt and nuance and, in so doing, calmed the fear. Regardless, there was a certain amount of fear in the air and it was catching. With messages designed to elevate your sense of threat, if you weren't frightened of the virus, did your fear switch direction? I was frightened of authoritarianism and the consequences of lockdown for our country. I observed the fear around me, I felt my own, and it led me to research and write this book. What do people do when they perceive a gap between reality and rationality? When their fear roams away from the path laid out by the state? If your rational mind looks at the evidence and says, well, this might be really bad, but it isn't going to be the plague, or even Spanish flu, and yet you are told it is the greatest threat in peacetime, what do you make of the panic? If you are told it is best for everyone to quarantine, including the sick, the potentially infectious and the healthy, even though that has never happened before, and you foresee economic devastation, what are you to make of the government using such a destructive policy without precedent or evidence? What if it feels like everyone around you is being inducted into a cult, using brand new language you don't relate to, the emotions flicking disorientatingly between fear and love bombing, and punishments for dissent are mandated, rewards for compliance seep into society, but you were impervious to the programming? People look for answers. Some people grow conspiracy theory in this gap between rationality and reality. A conspiracy theory is a theory about a plot which is carried out in secret, with a sinister end goal. The term has a negative connotation, the implication being that the conspiracy is based on insufficient evidence or prejudice or stupidity. Generally, it's considered that decent journalism, state-sponsored inquiries, whistleblowers and freedom of information requests are the bedrock of uncovering conspiracies. Until they are proven, they are conspiracy theories. State-sponsored inquiries are slow. Whistleblowers don't always come forward. And when they do, the media don't always want to go near them. It was Middle East Eye, not the broadsheets, which reported the extraordinary stories of government propaganda through RICU and external agencies employed by the unit. And freedom of information requests are sadly not a reliable way to extract information. In my own experience, they go unanswered or responses can be avoidant. Investigation and verifying claims is not straightforward. Absence of evidence could indicate that a theory is just a conspiracy theory, or it could mean the evidence is obscured for the time being. Although conspiracy theories have a bad reputation, some conspiracies turn out to be true, and people in power at the highest levels try and cover up what they are doing. In our own recent history in the UK, there are weapons of mass destruction used to justify an invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the lies perpetrated by South Yorkshire police after the Hillsborough disaster. Actor Sean Ward was surprised to find out that he might feature in a BBC documentary about people who have lost, or are losing loved ones down the conspiracy rabbit hole, and families ripped apart by harmful conspiratorial belief. A BBC TV researcher contacted Ward's sister through her personal Facebook account and her work email. Ward has been vocal about opposition to lockdown and also talked about vaccine concerns through his popular social media channels. The BBC researcher may perhaps characterize him as an anti-vaxxer and conspiracy theorist. He also received bad press, in his words, for attending anti-lockdown protests in London. But he feels his social media airings have been helpful to his followers and created a sense of community. Which is, of course, exactly the sort of influence the program makers are concerned about, blue ticks, influencing in the wrong way. Regardless of his beliefs and their veracity, the description of the program in the email, which he forwarded to me to read, to Ward's sister appeared to be quite one-sided, describing the big issues of people with huge numbers of followers sharing disinformation. They didn't specify what the disinformation consisted of in Ward's case though. The email nodded to mental health issues, but this would be a very sensitive area for the documentary makers to manage without psychologically harming their contributors and the family members they are talking about. I spoke with Ward about how the approach, made to his family behind his back, had affected him. I feel like I am easy pickings because I spoke about mental health and suicidal thoughts in 2018, he told me. Messaging my family feels very personal. This is especially painful because the BBC was my employer for years. My sister was quite worried about it the first time they approached her and now she is livid. She doesn't think they really have the content they need and that's why they need her. Ward's sister did not want to contribute to the program and the request had a sobering effect on the two of them. One can imagine that if families weren't ripped apart before the documentary, they might be after. This chapter belies my own fascination with conspiracy theory and, of course, this is an ideal area of exploration for a documentary, but there is a danger of upholding the tropes so favored during the epidemic of the co-video and conspiracy theorist, and using denigration to suppress dissent, as discussed in Chapter 13, The Climate of Fear. Media appears never to have been so partisan and propagandist, even while purporting to be the opposite. I decided to research people who fall under the umbrella term conspiracy theorist. To be honest, it was easy to uncover all kinds of theories among all kinds of people given that the gap between rationality and reality was more of a chasm. I interviewed two men, Steve and Alex, both of whom had pronounced theories and had taken action upon them. Steve's camouflage clothes and olive green Land Rover would have been well disguised in woodlands, but he was immediately obvious to me in the B&Q car park. Although cafes were open at the time, he'd wanted to meet somewhere anonymous, and suggested our salubrious setting. I got a coffee from the hot dog van and got into his car. I knew Steve from his job as a security guard in a local shop. I'd been chatting to him throughout lockdown about how business had been, how people reacted when face masks were mandated, if the people in the store had caught COVID. Every shopping trip is a research opportunity. In our many conversations we talked about what could be behind the UK government's pandemic policies. We'd arranged to meet away from his place of work so he could tell me about his theories. All my life I have been prepping. I am always doing risk assessments in my head, he told me. You have car insurance. Why not have a year's supply of rice? I said I thought that constantly planning for the worst sounded exhausting, but he was cheerful. It's not exhausting, because it's not happened yet. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I don't think this is it. I think this is a test run. In peacetime you prepare for war. I was curious about when he had started prepping. Back in the 1970s we had power shortages. I remember going down to the shops and not being able to buy sweets, so I started hoarding sweets. It started there. I was also in the army, he said. I was a child of the 70s too, and I remember the drawer always full of candles and matches, and that we needed them. I don't have a year's supply of rice, but I have a drawer of headlights, candles and matches, and I know that preparation for power cuts comes straight from my childhood. We talked about why he felt suspicious. I can smell a trap. What are the restrictions and the masks for? They aren't going to affect a virus, so why are they doing it? I think we're being trained for obedience. I had sympathy with this view. It seemed very likely that the UK had performed a U-turn on masks for psychological not medical reasons. We know that behavioral scientists think masks give a signal, which would inspire obedience to the lockdown rules. In a sense, Steve's interpretation is correct. If you perceive manipulation by the government it creates mistrust. So far, so reasonable. And as he said, things are a conspiracy theory until they happen. Steve continued, the Coronavirus Act is an enabling act like the Nazis had. And it's scary that governments around the world are acting similarly. Is someone else dishing out the control? I could see where he was coming from. The Coronavirus Act and Public Health Act were terrifyingly draconian, see Chapter 15, Tyranny, and one could potentially draw parallels with the Nazi legislation. And why did governments around the world adopt similar policies at the same time? These policies didn't come from existing pandemic planning literature and expertise. In fact, they were counter to it, so why? Were they copying each other, in a political version of playground psychology? We had to lock down, sir, the other boys did it. Or were policy changes being driven by another source, a sinister cabal of globalist puppeteers? I decided to test how out there Steve's beliefs might be. Did he believe aliens might be involved in controlling governments? I don't know, he said. He asked me if I thought there was intelligent life in the universe which might have visited Earth. Yes, I thought that was possible. His satisfied face told me he could rest his case. I asked whether he thought a COVID conspiracy was operated by the Masons or Illuminati. I'm not a Mason, so I wouldn't know. Fair enough. So, what was his theory? I think the virus could be man-made or released, he asserted. At one point this definitely would have sounded conspiracy-esque, or at least highly speculative. But by the time he and I met, the WHO still hadn't been granted access to the laboratory in Wuhan, China, and at the time of writing, British scientist Professor John Watson, who was involved in the eventual investigation, said he could not rule out a leak from the lab. Steve also thought that the pandemic response was to destroy the economies of the world, and said, "We can't service all this debt. If you can't pay the debt, you are in someone's pocket. Are we going to be living like China with a social credit? Is this about getting us all to have digital ID?" We had hit another inconvenient truth. Something that was seen as conspiracy theory, that COVID was an excuse to impose a digital ID system upon us, looks more likely in 2021. A logical conclusion to a pandemic in an age of technology? Opportunism by political leaders who want to bring in digital ID anyway? Or a predetermined plan? The UK government announced it would review a COVID certification scheme, or Freedom App, or vaccine passport. The European Union put forward a legislative proposal for a digital green pass that provides proof of vaccination or test results. Israel introduced a green pass. I pointed out that although he was open-minded, he didn't seem to know what was going on. That's right, he agreed. I don't know. All I know is you have 1% who have everything. Then a few more percent under them who control all of us. The middle classes are going now. I think we are sinking down lower and lower, and those that control us want a small number of super rich and the rest super poor. Well, there had been a huge upshift in wealth during the epidemic, so I could see why he thought this. US billionaire wealth grew $1.3 trillion between mid-March 2020 and February 2021. 2,000 of the world's wealthiest billionaires grew their collective wealth by 27.5%. Yet overall labor income dropped 10.7% globally, mainly in lower-income countries, and 150 million were expected to be pushed into extreme poverty by 20,217 by the pandemic, or rather the lockdowns and restrictions. I had a lot of sympathy with some of Steve's views. I even shared some to an extent, although I couldn't say whether these end results were the result of sinister secret conspiracies, opportunism, disaster capitalism, or just bad luck. Steve was sure something was going on, but also didn't know what. His genuine curiosity about the world, plus an appetite to read and communicate with others of similar views, seemed to have combined with a childhood predilection for being prepared. While many would call him a conspiracy theorist and prepper, I think his beliefs were more nuanced. He would have predicted digital ID, a destabilized world economy, and a wealth grab by elites at the beginning of the pandemic, and he would have been right. On the other hand, he thought aliens could be the masterminds of it all. Steve's Land Rover was a cornucopia of useful items. He had freeze-dried food, water canisters, spare fuel, tools, spare clothes. He told me he could drive into the woods and survive for days. I asked why. What did he think might be coming? I've been ready this year to pack my bags and go. My wife believes in all this reluctantly. She doesn't want to believe something else is going on, but she does. I'm always prepared because you never know. He told me they had bought some woodland and were building a cabin, so that if the time came, they could live off-grid. He described him as being in a transitional period, as they prepared for the worst-case scenario. They had a ready supply of fuel, a log burner, and a year's supply of rice. He had been buying small pieces of gold for years and had a good supply of carbon arrows. Arrows? That sounded apocalyptic. Would we be shooting each other with bows and arrows? I practice archery. I like it, it's a hobby. That doesn't detract from the fact that it's a post-apocalyptic survival skill. I asked Steve what was next. Tier 3 or full lockdown around Christmas. I think worse is coming. 2021 something will happen. There could be riots when people come off furlough. We can't go on like this forever. I talked to Alex over Zoom. Although we could have met during the dizzying freedom granted by the government during the summer of 2020, he'd already moved to Sweden. He told me that he'd had enough of England, the government and the media. He had been shocked at how quickly the British public acquiesced to the restrictions on their lives, and said he and his family decided not to play the game, but to try life somewhere else. The public health and political systems are somewhat uncoupled, so it's less crazy here. You don't read about COVID on signs everywhere, it's not in the media 24/7. Sweden didn't turn COVID into a political game, he told me. Despite what you see in the media in the UK, the Swedes are quite proud of the way they responded. No one here thinks they could or should have done a lockdown. I asked how he had felt when the pandemic started, and he told me that Fright Night had a profound effect on him, just as it had on me. It was weird, like the Queen's speech on Christmas Day. The whole family was together. I was in the moment. I get chills when I think about it. It was like a show. Boris came out with buffoon hair. They hadn't brushed it, which seemed a bit odd. I was impressed by the swift escape to Sweden. I think it was an enviable move. In truth, most people would have enjoyed life in Sweden better during 2020. No lockdown Sweden is an awkward counterfactual to lockdown UK. The country followed existing pandemic protocol and didn't try the brand new lockdown experiment. The Swedes have largely been entrusted with government guidance rather than law and, as a result, life has carried on more normally and the economy saw a much milder downturn than the UK, with a 2.9% contraction in GDP, rather than the UK's 11.3%. Lockdown fanatics think Sweden pursued a reckless strategy and fared less well than its Scandinavian neighbours, while lockdown critics praise the gods that a control exists to show how a pandemic can be managed without putting people under virtual house arrest. When Sweden did not lock down, gloomy modelers predicted 100,000 deaths by the 1st of July. In fact, there were only 5,490 deaths. I asked how they managed to travel there. It was easy, Alex laughed, travel wasn't as restricted then as it is now. We packed up and drove here. We barely even needed masks on the way. We knew we had a window to travel and then the restrictions would get worse in the UK. Curiously, he was right, traveling did become harder. So, what were his theories about why this was happening? This isn't about COVID. This is an excuse to crash the economy. I've known it's coming for years. I just didn't know it would be a virus, he told me. Governments are printing the shit out of money. Wealth is shifting upwards more, and the rich are using this new money in a wealth grab to buy resources, like land. We're playing a massive game of Monopoly. I don't think we ordinary people can win anymore. We can't throw the board over and say we're not playing the game anymore. It's too late for that. And so he moved to Sweden because the economy will be stronger. No, I think we're about to see the collapse of the Western world. A lot of people will die. You have to be prepared to be one of them. I don't think Sweden will escape from this. All countries will get there in the end. I'm not under any illusion that coming here is a permanent escape. But there are 10 million people here and a lot of land. There are 70 million in the UK. I think it's going to be messy and I'll do what I can to keep me and my family out of it. Well, we are quantitative easing the shit out of money. This was a bit frightening. Fear is contagious. Because his theory echoed my own early fears. Knowing that the government was pursuing such an economically harmful policy had frightened me. However, I had tried to remain observant about concerns and emotions, and I'd talked to a variety of friends about their interpretations of events in order to sense-check myself. I asked Alex if he thought he was paranoid. No. There is nothing new going on right now. Plenty of people have predicted this. The virus provides cover for crashing the economic system and bringing in a new system that will purport to be for the people but is not. There will be digital ID, We'll go cashless, you won't be able to travel anywhere without being vaccinated up to the eyeballs, and there will be a grab of the tangible assets. I've been predicting an economic crash since 2012. By the time of publication, more of Alex's predictions seem to be bearing fruit. I asked how he thought this worked. How and why would our democratically elected leaders coordinate to crash the world economy? There's insane worldwide money printing, he said, so this is obviously a worldwide plan. Johnson and Starmer aren't in charge. They are high-level masons. They are working for others. Who do you think? I didn't know. That was why I was asking him. Alex didn't want to go into much more detail. At no point in this so-called pandemic did I ever feel fear about it. I always knew I'd be fine. I'm healthy, said Alex, when I asked if he was scared. What frightened me was seeing everything I've read about and believed would happen, come to pass at warp speed. They aren't playing games, they are going for it. Knowing where this could go is scary. Theories flourish in the gap between what we know makes rational sense and our lived reality. So much of the response to the COVID epidemic did not make sense. World leaders did act similarly. They used the same language. Was this evidence of coordination behind the scenes, or was it linguistic contagion? Were they acting in sinister lockstep, or were they copying each other? They pursued lockdown strategies that might save lives, although there was no evidence that they would, while knowing they would cause economic and societal harm which would cost lives. What is an intelligent and imaginative person to theorize? Broadly, we might assume government plans were carefully considered, or that a conspiracy was driving events, or that it was all a big cock-up. The initial response looked wise, precautionary and justifiable to many people, and it still does to some. By this point my lockdown critical colors are nailed firmly to the mast. Conspiracy can be as extreme as believing that aliens are pulling strings behind the scenes, or that 5G masts are going to poison us, or it can be more believable. How about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset? Some people think the government's response to COVID is a smokescreen to disguise their participation in this reset, a radical restructuring of the economy and society. The World Economic Forum also uses the slogan, "Build Back Better." My first thought when I heard that was that, if we are building back, a degree of destruction has been wrought first. Might I suggest a modest refurbishment instead? The Great Reset is no conspiracy theory, it's a manifesto, a plan, laid out in black and white. And does it tie into COVID? Yes. If Professor Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, has his way. He said, the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. The World Economic Forum published an article by Ida Auken, one of their young global leaders and a Danish member of parliament, entitled, "Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, have no privacy and life has never been better." It's supposed to be a provocative enticement to consider the sort of future the WEF imagines, but I would retitle it, "Welcome to 2030, I am a serf and have never been so gullible." It's an incredibly unpalatable imagining of the future. Every Englishman's home is his castle, and I think that owning nothing and squatting in a communal living space is going to be a very hard sell in this country indeed. In February 2020, a World Economic Forum tweet stated, "Lockdowns are quietly improving cities around the world," and celebrated the closures of factories and the deserted streets while earthquake scientists can work more effectively. This is by no means evidence of a conspiracy, but does suggest an incredibly out-of-touch technocratic approach to life. The tweet did not hit the right note and they deleted it. Maybe influential international organizations, world leaders and business are conspiring to bring about certain changes in the world. That would be for another book. It strays too far from my remit, and there are thousands of digital rabbit holes for you to explore. Or maybe the answers lie in cock-ups. Of course governments, international organizations and individual scientists make mistakes. Fear clouds rational judgment. Then they might try to hide their mistakes. Maybe between conspiracy and cock-up are conflicts of interest and convergent agendas. Less overarching than a grand conspiracy theory, they could account for lobbying, sympathetic media exposure and high-level handshakes and contracts. News about conflicts of interest seeped out slowly during the epidemic. SAGE members' financial interests have still not been published at the time of writing. The BMJ reported in December 2020 that the government was withholding SAGE and other advisory bodies' competing interests, such as whether they had financial interests in pharmaceutical companies receiving government contracts. The BMJ reported that, throughout the pandemic, allegations of financial conflicts of interest have circled many public and private actors in many jurisdictions. In the UK, the government's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, made headlines when he was shown to have financial ties to the drug company GlaxoSmithKline. The journal also reported on the Wellcome Trust's conflicts of interest. Its pharmaceutical investments overlap with its research efforts. Both Wellcome and the Gates Foundation are positioned to potentially benefit financially from its leading role in the pandemic response. And the UK government acted unlawfully in failing to publish details of dozens of contracts awarded without competition for goods and services such as personal protective equipment. Governments enact controversial policies and businesses profit from the exploitation of natural disasters, while a population is understandably distracted and looking at danger. This is disaster capitalism, as described by Naomi Klein in her book The Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. This is cashing in on chaos rather than shadowy conspiracy theory. When people panic, they are pliable. When people are pliable, there is profit to be made. Is it any wonder that once the initial impact of fear has receded, some minds race? Government leaders emulated cult leaders, albeit unintentionally, one hopes, manipulating our emotions, weaponizing our fear against us, wreaking havoc on the economy, culture and mental health of the nation, and behaving in eerie unison with other countries, even parroting the same slogans, Build Back Better, for instance. This creates the perfect crucible for conspiracy theories. If the inevitable inquiry is halfway decent, no doubt it will uncover some uncomfortable truths. These may ultimately reveal an alchemy of careful consideration, conspiracy and cock-up. It is tempting to blame the whole mess on a malevolent cult, a cabal or an evil leader. After all, we could then find them, expose them and take them down. They can't hide in the shadows forever. While I don't think we will find anything so simple, convenient and predictably evil lurking in the shadows, I think we should look to our own shadows for the answers. Carl Jung wrote about the shadow and the danger of psychological projection. Our shadow is the instinctive and irrational side of ourselves. Essentially, it is more comfortable to remain ignorant of our failings, so we project them onto other people or mythic figures, baddies. The devil is the ultimate projection of our shadow. Jung recognized that there is a tendency within collectivist movements to project elements from the shadow onto others. The vast scale of the global fear response to COVID and the shocking social re-engineering it has instigated leads me to intuit that there are deep, collective unconscious forces at work. Although COVID is a real disease and SARS-CoV-2 is a real virus, some of the response felt unreal, if you were not caught up in the cult-like response. We have not just endured and tolerated but even demanded the curtailment of our freedoms, for a disease which has a median infection fatality rate of 0.05% for under 70-year-olds globally. Our response felt unmoored from the gravity of the threat. Why? I spoke to Jungian psychotherapist, James Caspian, about mass delusions. He pointed out that Jung lived through the striking and destructive collective movements of the World Wars and the Cold War. What he said then about mass movements, the shadow and projection can be applied to what is happening in the world now. In times of distress, people turn to visions of utopian or apocalyptic scenarios, Caspian said. Jung said the really dangerous point is when insight and reflection are crushed by the mass movement and the state succumbs to a fit of weakness in that scenario. I think that's happening. The state is afraid of some of the mass movements, such as political correctness. Rational argument is only possible if the emotionality of a situation does not exceed a critical degree. In that case, reason will be supplanted by slogans and fantasies. A collective possession develops which turns into a psychic epidemic. The looming collective shadow has resulted in mass delusions and mass hysteria before. Humans do this, more often than you would think. Here is a collection of eclectic examples. During the Salem witch trials in 1692–93 there were hundreds of accusations of witchcraft and ultimately 19 executions. A laughter epidemic in a girls' boarding school in Tanganyika in 1962 saw up to 159 girls laugh continuously for days in an outbreak of mass hysteria. The glass delusion was a mental illness particularly affecting the noble classes, most common in the 16th and 17th centuries, whereby aristocrats believed they were made of glass and could literally shatter to death. The 1528 dancing plague of Strasbourg was an inexplicable instance of mass delusion, with hundreds of people compelled to dance, some to the death. In other examples of mass hysteria, if not psychic epidemics, the War of the Worlds radio broadcast caused panic among listeners in the United States who thought the Martians really had invaded. And James Thurber wrote in My Life and Hard Times about the day when everybody in his town, Columbus, thought the nearby dam had broken and ran miles to escape, shouting, "Go east." The dam hadn't burst and, regardless, the water never could have reached the town anyway. It was a fascinating insight into the contagion of fear and its ability to affect the rational mind. No one had questioned where the rumor started, or noticed the reassuring lack of water, and they hadn't even got on their horses or started their cars. They just ran, like lemmings. I asked Caspian how people can protect themselves, and how can societies protect themselves from psychic epidemics. Jung wrote a book called The Undiscovered Self, Caspian told me, and he talked about the plight of the modern individual. To become truly individual, that person would need to misidentify from the collective. Most people are caught up in the collective and in movements and live out their life like that. It's easier and more comfortable to be swept along. To individuate means in practice that we say there is a collective movement, but we think critically about it and we are not prepared to be swept along by it. Jung said that it is not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is the greatest danger to man. If the UK, and maybe much of the world, is suffering a psychic epidemic, how do we learn from this experience and recover now, but importantly protect against the next one? A psychic epidemic has the potential to be far more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. The supreme danger which threatens individuals as well as whole nations is a psychic epidemic, not a viral epidemic. After Hitler's defeat, Jung concluded, the phenomenon we have witnessed in Germany was nothing less than the first outbreak of epidemic insanity, an eruption of the unconscious into what seemed to be a tolerably well-ordered world. The role of the government should be to moderate and contain a psychic epidemic and mass delusion, not to exaggerate and multiply it. If fear was an open door in spring 2020, the UK government did not allow us to walk through it, but used a battering ram to knock it down.